Welcome to Unit 5 of Practical Measurement. This module is focused on feasibility. Feasibility is about how doable the actual process of data collection is, given the limits of logistics, operations, and systematic limitations that we might face in different contexts and countries. The last video was about feasibility of tool selection, and this video is about feasibility of the measurement design process. This module is not focused on study design, and so we're not focused on feasibility of the whole study design process, but rather we'll only be talking about feasibility around the measurement component. So the first thing to think about when you think about feasibility is, what does your sample look like? And first you need to think about your sample for your pilot test. A rule of thumb is that you need about 30 to 40 children for a pilot test. And this is 30 to 40 children per group. So if you're doing a pilot test for grade 1 and grade 2, you would need about 30 to 40 children per grade. Another thing to think about is that you want your sample for your pilot test to look very similar to the sample for your final data collection. When it comes to final data collection, your sample size is really going to differ. For tracking and screening, oftentimes your sample size is the entire population because you need to make decisions about individual children. For situation analyses, monitoring, and evaluation, the first thing you need to do to figure out your sample size is define your population. Your population is all children to whom the findings of your study will be generalized. So if you have a 5-year program, the population might be all children who are part of the program over the 5 years. The next thing you need to do is figure out your sampling frame. Your sampling frame are kids who can actually be part of the sample viably when you're doing the study. So if you have a 5-year program, the sampling frame might be only the children during the year when you're doing the study. Once you have your population and your sampling frame, you can use an online sample size calculator, we'll attach some below, for you to actually figure out an appropriate sample size. Now, there are more rigorous, sophisticated methods of thinking about sample size, but this method should give you an appropriate enough sample size for a situation analysis, for monitoring, or for a simple program evaluation. The next thing you need to think about is training actual assessors. And one question I keep getting is, who are the assessors? I have found it really useful to hire assessors who are from the same community or similar community as the children who are part of the study. This is because they often know the language really well, but also know the mannerisms and cultural nuances that allow them to communicate with children appropriately. You also may need to consider the gender of the assessors, as well as whether they speak the languages in which you're doing the assessment. Finally, you might have to think about how many assessors do you need. To do this, you need to know what your sample size is, how many assessments an assessor can do on a given day. If you're doing a learning and development assessment that is pretty complicated with performance-based measures and Likert-based measures and some observations, I would say no more than 5 assessments per day. And then once you know how many actual days you have for data collection, if you use the formula on the screen, you'll be able to calculate the number of assessors you actually need. One hint is that you should probably hire 2 to 3 assessors more than the actual number you need, and be fully transparent with them that all assessors can attend the assessor training and the field test, but that you'll only hire X number of assessors for the actual data collection. This allows you to narrow down on assessors who give you the most reliable and rigorous performance during the assessment. What does an actual assessor training look like? Well, if you have a straightforward enough assessment, maybe 20 items that all have the same response option, you don't need a very long assessor training. But in my experience, most learning and development assessments are fairly complex and require very in-depth assessor trainings. Normally, the first day is focused on an introduction to the program, introduction to the assessment tool itself, introduction to the design of the study, and then we go over research ethics with the assessor and how they should be collecting data with children, how they should be asking either parents or guardians for consent, and how they should be asking children for assent for collecting data. The second day, we normally review all of the tools line by line, and on the third day, we focus on role-playing and practicing in pairs, creating fish bowls where assessors practice in pairs while others watch and give feedback. Day 4 is normally a field test where we go out and collect data, and day 5, we debrief with assessors to understand the administration as well as the logistical challenges that came up. The next thing to consider is how you're actually going to manage the data you collect. And this process differs based on whether you're collecting data on paper or if you're collecting data using an electronic data collection platform on a tablet or a smartphone. For paper-based, you have to really worry about the versions of the different paper versions that you have. I've had situations where the final version that goes out for data collection is actually the field test version because there was a printing error. This doesn't often happen with electronic data collection because there's normally a hub online that has the final tool that you can update as needed. But one thing to think about is normally with electronic data collection, the version of the operating system or the firmware on the tablet itself may play a role. You also need to consider transportation. How do you get the assessments, either paper, to the field and back? And also, how do you get the tablets to assessors and back? Do they keep them over the entire data collection period, or do they hand them in every night? The next thing to think about is security. It's not as much of a concern with paper, but with a tablet, even though tablets and cell phones are becoming fairly ubiquitous, there are certain places where an assessor walking around with a tablet or a cell phone can draw negative attention and put them at risk. You also need to think about data checking and data entry when it comes to paper-based data collection. I've had multiple situations where on paper an assessor forgets a page or two pages stick together and they forget to assess some pieces of the assessment for children. Data checking while children are still with the assessor becomes important, and this can often be done by a supervisor at the specific location. You also need to enter paper-based data collection into an electronic platform like Excel. This normally takes about half the time it takes to collect the data itself. And lastly, you need to think about storage. For most assessments, you need to store all of the paper-based assessments to the end of the program, and sometimes even longer. And for tablets, how do you store the tablets so that they maintain their integrity and don't degrade over a program period? Next, you need to think about what you need to do to actually plan for data collection. You might need to organize logistics and procure materials for assessors. So for example, if you have assessors going out with a flip book and a piece of paper and color pencils and a stopwatch, it's good to create packets for this for each assessor to carry into the field. You might also have to get required permissions from a school or a learning center, as well as parental consent before collecting data from children. It's good to develop a data collection timeline and maybe put your assessors into groups with one of the assessor being a supervisor. The supervisor would be responsible for ensuring that the assessment environment is calm and quiet and appropriate, and away from the earshot of other adults and children, but within the eyesight of another assessor or of the supervisor. The supervisor can also be responsible for identifying spaces to use in inclement weather and organizing appropriate seating for assessors. The last thing to think about is how do you select a random sample of children. Let's say you have to collect data from grade 1 children from 40 schools, and on average there are 50 grade 1 children in each of the schools. It's very unlikely that you will have to collect data from each of the 50 children in each of the 40 schools. It's more likely that you might have to collect data from 10 children, 10 girls and 10 boys, in each of the 40 schools. I would not advise asking a teacher or administrator to select those students for you because they might give you the best performing children. What would be better is to randomly select those children. There are two options. One is to do it before you go out to collect data. And you can do this if you have a really good list of all the children, put it into Excel, generate a random number, sort by the random number, and then just count down the first 10 boys and 10 girls that you need. Option 2 is to do the random selection while you're at the school or learning center. And this can be done if you have a good attendance list. You can sort the attendance list and on an Android app, look up a random number generator. Let's say your number is 3 and start counting down from the top and select every third boy or third girl. You could also do this physically if you don't have a good attendance list. Line up all the boys and all the girls and go down the row and count every third boy and every third girl. And when you get to the end, continue from the start. So some key takeaways from this module. There is no magic number for sample size, it varies. And online sample size calculators might be rudimentary, but they give you a really good idea of the kind of sample size you will require to collect for the different studies you might do. Rigorous assessor training is critical, but it's a really good investment. The assessments that have gone bad in my own career have been assessments where I haven't paid sufficient time and energy and had sufficient resource to do a quality assessor training. And so focusing on robust quality assessor training is critical and pays off in the long run. And lastly, when possible, try and collect data electronically. The upfront cost of buying tablets is important to consider, but it actually pays for itself if you have multiple rounds of data collection and don't have to worry about data checking or data entry.